Hi, I'm Bruce Eckel,
And I'm James Ward.
and this is First Steps in Flex, and we're going to look at web services. So all the stuff that we've been doing so far has been kind of isolated on our machine and everything, and these days it's all about the web. So
That's right.
how do we talk to other things? And I mean, I suppose you could even talk to other programs running on your machine written in some other language or technology.
If you're building
as
an
well.
Air application, yeah, you definitely could if it exposed some API. Yeah, so in a Flex application, probably the number one question that we get about Flex is how do I connect Flex to MySQL or some database or PHP or whatever. And so there's actually a number of different ways to do that. And the basic idea, though, is that anything that we can do over HTTP, we can connect to from Flex. So Flex can't connect to a MySQL server because MySQL doesn't talk HTTP. I mean, we could probably write a binary driver to talk to MySQL's database directly, but that's not the best way to do things in Flex. We want to use the HTTP protocol as the way that we communicate with our backend servers and services or other third-party web services. And so there's a lot of different ways, even with HTTP, how we communicate to these services.
So the next question is, how hard is it?
Yeah, so it's easy.
Good.
And so let's take a look.
I like things that are easy.
So these web services can be a variety of different styles. They can be just plain old XML, they can be RESTful, they can be JSON, they can be SOAP, or binary protocols like AMF.
One of my favorites, XML-RPC.
XML-RPC, absolutely. And so what we're going to look at first is, let's actually jump into the browser, and we're going to go to firststepsinflex.com/bookmarks.xml. And so this is an XML file that is up on our server that just has some bookmarks in it. And so if we actually view the source here, we'll see that this is just plain old XML. We see this bookmarks thing. We see there's a bunch of repeated item nodes, and then those have a name and a URL. These could come from PHP. They could come from Java. They can come from .NET. Anything that can output XML, we can then use as a way to get to our backend data or update data and those sorts of things. So what we're going to do is build a Flex application that connects to that XML web service. And so the important thing to point out here is that Flex applications, while they're in the browser, they run client-side. And so anytime we want to talk to the server, we have to make a network request to do that because we're actually connecting from the client to the server. So let's go create a new Flex project here, and we'll call this one HTTP SRV. So we're going to use just the basic HTTP networking library in Flex. And so let's go back to the default layout there. And what we're first going to add is this tag HTTP service. So HTTP service, we can do any HTTP request over it.
You're really creating an object, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm creating an instance of this HTTP service. And then I'm going to set the URL of it to be that XML file that is up on our server.
Now, when I create that object, does it automatically go out to that URL?
No,
and
we
grab
have to
the information?
not yet. We have to actually tell it to do that request.
So you've just created this object and told it when you are activated, here's the URL you're going to go to.
Exactly. And one of the nice things that HTTP service will do for us is it automatically converts XML into either E4X or into objects. The default is objects. And so those are just different ways that we can get that data. We don't want it just as a text blob. We really want it in some format that we can work with it. And so either objects or E4X if we're using XML. So let's now add something to show us this data. So I'm going to add a data grid, and I'm going to set the data provider to something. So our data provider now, what it is we are going to fetch or bind this data grid's data provider to some place where this data is being stored once it's been deserialized from the source XML file that we fetched over the network. And so what we're going to do is bind to srv.lastResult. That's just a place where the HTTP service stores its data. And then we're also going to bind to not just that, because that would get us to the top of the structure. We actually want to get down to the array of item here. And so to get to that, what we're going to do is do .bookmarks.item.
And what's bookmarks?
So bookmarks, what's happening is that when HTTP service gets this XML, it turns it into objects.
Bookmarks
and so
is our container.
So so what's interesting is that you may have noticed that code hinting worked for last result. Let me show this again. So I see last result, but then if I do a dot after last result,
service object, right?
Exactly. Yep. And so that's last result is just an object. And so when this HTTP service comes back, it's going to actually set some data on this last result. And so it doesn't know right now what is on that. And it's actually a dynamic object, which allows it to have these arbitrary properties set on it when that data gets deserialized.
So basically, you're just traversing the structure of our XML blob.
That's exactly right. But in the default, it's actually converted the XML into objects. So I'm actually traversing down the converted XML. So I'm traversing down the object structure.
So you can use the dot notation of an object.
Exactly. Right? Yep. And this is because that last result was dynamic. It doesn't have to be a typed object, and we can in some other methods actually convert the data into typed objects as well. But in this case, we're just using some dynamic.
But you told me
features.
that just by creating the HTTP service object, it didn't do anything. So where does last result come from?
It's a property on HTTP service that gets set when we actually get the data back from the service. So the last thing we need to do here is I'm going to add an event handler that actually will create that request to the server. So we do srv.send. Send can take parameters if we want to send request parameters to the server. With this request, in this case, we're not sending any parameters. So we're just going to do just a basic HTTP request to this URL. That's going to go to the server, fetch the XML as text, send the text across the wire in the HTTP response, or not HTML response, but the HTTP response. And then when we get the response back in the HTTP service, it's going to then deserialize the XML and then update the srv.lastResult property with the deserialized XML.
Now, here you've attached it to the application complete event, which happens when the application has set itself up.
Yep.
And that's just for convenience and minimal code, but you could attach it to a button.
To a button click event or anything we want. Yep. Yep, so let's go give this a try. So there we go. Oh. And you'll see it happen pretty darn quickly there. We got our data grid. So we see the properties here with the data that came back from that XML file. And so the data grid figured out, what the name, what the column name should be based on the properties in those objects.
Is there a way to tell the data grid to automatically widen to fit all of the text?
What we can do is we can set the data grid's width to be wider, or if we explicitly define our columns, we could set some properties on those. But out of the box, it's just kind of giving us a default sizing of data grid.
Mm-hmm. Oh, but you could set it to like 100% or something if you want
right.
to.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
There we go. Okay. Nice. Excellent.
Yeah, so that's the basic way that we communicate with servers via XML, and I want to make one modification to this application to show one other way that we can use. So rather than using data binding here to get this data into the data grid, what we can instead do is set up an event handler on HTTP service. And
why would you do that instead of data binding?
So if you wanted to massage that data or convert it into structured objects or something like that before you actually give it to the data grid, you would probably want to do it this way instead of using data binding.
So this way we're inserting ourselves in between rather than just
exactly.
connecting directly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's now go into this HTTP service, and what I'm going to do is set a result event handler. So in this result event handler, what I'm going to say is, so this is when we get a result back, I'm just going to set the data grid's data provider equal to event.result.bookmarks dot item. So this is going to do the same exact thing that data binding did, but this time we'll do it through this result event handler.
And you could, in this case, mess with the data before.
Exactly. So we see it works the same exact way. One other interesting thing about doing it this way is now we can actually set a breakpoint here on this line of code, whereas before there was no actual executable line of code. We can't debug MXML per se because it's not actually executed. It's declarative.
Well, the data binding is not. You can't see it in the code. It just the code
it just happens. Let's launch this in the debugger. So now we can hit this breakpoint and see what's happening in this result event.
And now to do this, don't you have to have a special version of the Flash Player installed?
You do, yeah. So you may get an error message saying that you don't have the debug version of Flash Player. In that case, you need to just search Google for Flash Player Debugger, download, and make sure you get the latest Flash Player Debugger version. You cannot debug in the regular kind of consumer version of Flash Player. You have to have a special version of Flash Player that enables it. And that allows developers just to have a different environment, more different than the consumer one. The consumer one is faster and is smaller. The debugger is really for developers. So let's launch the debugger. And so what happened was immediately we hit that breakpoint. So you'll see we're stopped there and it's asking us, do we want to go into the Flash debugging perspective? And so we say yes. And now we're in Eclipse's debugger and debugging this application. So we can see the stack trace. We can come in and step through code, step over all the typical things. We can come in and see what this is, which in this case is our application. We can see the event property, which we were talking about, and how that gets passed in. So it's of type result event. We can come in and see the event.result, and now we'll see the different objects that we're actually referencing here. So we're saying event.result.bookmarks.item. We can actually drill in and see those objects here in the debugger as well. So there's all of our data. So that's just a really great way to kind of see what's going on when you're getting data back from the server. So we'll hit resume, and now our application is running again. We see our data.
Well, okay, this is great, but this is just using regular HTTP, right? And I hear that the big up and coming protocol is SOAP.
Yep, so SOAP is definitely one option that we can use for talking to third-party web services or talking to our own web services. And so let's now just go create a new Flex project here. We'll call this one SOAP. And so in this one, instead of using the HTTP service library, we're going to use a different library called web service. So let's go in and add this web service tag in. Web service is used only for doing SOAP stuff. So I'm going to call it SRV, and then I'm going to set the WSDL URL. So WSDL is just what we use to talk to a SOAP service, and the service that we're going to talk to is www.webservice.net/uszip.asmx ? WSDL. So this is a web service that will give us the weather, or is it weather? No, just information about a zip code. Right. Okay. So then let's inside of our web service, what we're going to define is the web service or the SOAP operation that we're going to call. So we're going to say mx:\operation and specify the name of the operation as get info by zip. And where this comes from is actually the WSDL. So if we go open up this WSDL inside of the browser, we should actually see some information about this web service. So here's the WSDL. If we search for that get info by zip, you'll see that this is an operation that's defined somewhere down in this web service. There we go. Operation get info by zip. There's also some other operations as well. Get info by city. So these are the operations that we can call on this web service. This is all just following the SOAP standard. And so now let's, in our web service, actually before we tell it what to do, let's go add a data grid so we can display our data. We'll give this a ID there of DG. So now in our operation, what we're going to say is not request, but result. So what we want to do is set a result handler for this operation. So we're saying in this operation, when we get a result, so when we call get info by zip, what we're going to do is set our data grid's data provider equal to event.result.new data set.table. And all this is the deserialized SOAP that's been turned into objects. And if you look through the WSDL, you'd see how we came up with that. Okay, so then last thing here is we're going to add an event handler, application complete. And what we're going to say is SRV, so we're going to call our web service. And then we're going to actually invoke this get info by zip. And what's your zip code here, Bruce? We'll
81224.
81224. So what we're going to do is try to get some information about that 81224 zip code.
So now here where you set the data provider to this, does that causes some sort of change event so that the data grid will then update all the information?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when we set the data provider property, it has a setter that then will cause the data grid to figure out what the columns will be and put the data into the rows. Okay. So let's run this one and see what happens there. So there we go, and we got some information about the zip code. So you're in Crested Butte, Colorado. We're in Crested Butte.
We are.
We see the time zone, mountain time zone, the area code, those sorts of things. So this is just a public web service. Anyone can use this to get information about zip codes or cities. And it's just a really simple example for how to talk to SOAP web services.
So now we're running this application inside of a browser, and when we make any network requests, do those requests, do they go through the browser, they go around it, and what sort of limitations are we going to run into because of that?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Sandboxing or something.
So when we make a network request, an HTTP network request in a Flex application, it's actually using the browser's networking APIs to do that. So what that means is that any cookies that have been set, any authentication information is also going to be passed in that request, just like it would as if we were making that request from the browser. And so that's great because then authentication and the things that we're familiar with are going to work the exact same way in a Flex application as if they would in a regular web application, HTML web application. So, but there are some limitations with this. So in this case, what we're doing is we're accessing a web service that's up on this webservicex.net website. And so if we were to put this Flex application up live on firststepsinflex.com per se, then what we run into is that the browser by default doesn't allow us to make requests from First Steps in Flex to this other web server.
No, wait, that's the browser or the Flex app?
The browser, actually.
Oh, okay.
The browser has what's called the same origin policy, which allows content from a website to only make requests back to the website from which that content originated. So this is a general limitation, a security limitation in the browser. There are some things that get around this. So for instance, you can load images or JavaScript or iframes from anywhere you want. But the way that the browser sandbox works is that while you can make those requests, you can't actually get to the contents of the response. And so in this case, what we actually want to do is we don't just want to make the request. We actually want to get to the contents of the response. So that would actually violate the browser same origin policy. And so there's two ways to get around this. One is to use something called cross-domain policy files, where webservicex.net or any server that's serving web services of any sort, and this is not just for SOAP, this is any network request in Flex, could put a cross-domain policy file on their server that would allow you to make requests from your website from content loaded from your website to this other website.
So basically that server decides that it's okay for other people to get access to their content.
Yeah. And so for example, Flickr has a cross-domain policy file that allows any website, any content loaded from anywhere to make requests to api.flickr.com. And it's very important that they put this on api.flickr.com. If they had put it on, let's say, www.flickr.com, you'll see that page is not found. And the reason for that is that you really can run into some problems with security and cross-domain policy files. you can get into some pretty bad security problems. So what they've done is they know that API.flickr.com never uses cookies for authentication. So that's why they could put this star cross-domain policy file on their web server and know that it's going to be safe. So really, cross-domain policy files can get pretty tricky to make sure that you keep your content secure. One of the problems that frequently happens in Flex is people run into these security sandbox issues, and so they just throw up a cross-domain policy file, and then that, in a lot of cases, can open them up to security vulnerabilities. And so my recommendation is always to, unless you really understand what you're doing with cross-domain policy files, to use the second method of dealing with the same origin policy. And so that second method, what it does is it says that rather than making the request from webservicesx.net, what I'm going to do is instead make a request to the server from which this application is coming. So if we put it on firststepsinflex.com, I would instead make this request to firststepsinflex.com. But then I would have firststepsinflex.com proxy that request over to web service X.
So basically you ask our server to go ask their server to get the data and then feed it back to us.
Yep. And that would not be violating the same origin policy, and it would avoid a lot of the security problems that you can run into with the cross-domain policy files. So there's a lot of different ways to set up a proxy. You can use Apache, you can use BlazeDS, number of different proxy servers out there, and lots of information for.
Or you could probably just write a little, Perl script or something to do the work for
sure.
It sounds inherently, just off the top of my head, it does sound safer.
It is much safer.
Ask your server to do it for you rather than...
Yeah, okay. Definitely. So if you don't fully understand cross-domain policy files and how to do them correctly, avoid them because you can get into some really bad situations and use proxies instead.
Great.
Yeah, so that's the major thing to know about when doing these network requests from Flex applications and the security constraints and limitations that we have.
So we've only done two different kinds of network requests. We've done HTTP and we've done web services, but there's a bunch of others. And is there support for those built in, or do you hunt around for them on the web, or how does that work?
Yeah, so if you want to do JSON, for instance, then there's an open source library called the AS3 Core Lib that has a JSON library in it that you could use to support JSON. The XML RPC you could use with just HTTP service.
That's built in.
Yeah, okay. Just built in. And then there's the binary protocols like AMF, and those we get into in the next chapter in the book, but we're not going to get into it in the screencast because it's rather complex to go through and set up the server and all those sorts of things.
But sometimes, for some protocols, AMF is already... doesn't Python have some support for AMF?
Yeah. So you can do AMF in Python, Java, Ruby, .NET, lots of different ways. And so because there's so many different ways
faster,
to do
right?
AMF is much faster. And so, I have some screencasts on my blog where I go through how to set all this stuff up. And but I think that we're going to avoid that in our screencast because of the complexity and all the different pieces that have to be set up in order to support that. But yeah, so there's lots of different ways that we can make these network requests from a Flex application to the server.